But with these classes being, 3 hours long, we are entitled to essentially a 30-minute break. And so the question is do you want to take a 30-minute break in the middle of class, or do you want to just shave off the last 30 minutes?
Shave off the last 30 minutes.
So yeah, most students
Shave
want
off
to
the
do
last
that.
30
Yeah,
minutes.
30 minutes, past 30 minutes.
Shave it off.
Yeah, and I prefer that myself, both so I have a chance to rest before my next class. And the other thing too is that it's been demonstrated that student retention diminishes substantially after a break in a long course. Whereas if we just kind of go through it and then take off a little bit earlier at the end, you'll tend to remember quite a bit. So let me see here. All right. Oh. So, and I apologize, we probably won't get through all of this today. I'll do the best I can, and I will make some kind of little recording and post up the rest for the week. Like I said, again, anytime, we have to take up a substantial amount of class with answering questions, we always kind of run that risk. So, like I said, last week was considered the first week. I realized the courses didn't start then, but that was the first week of classes. So like I said, this week is considered week 2 because week 15 is week 15 regardless. It was unfortunate that our class meeting day fell on a holiday. And that happened last semester too, which is kind of weird. I think Helen Fulton in future kind of needs to rearrange its schedule with that a little bit. So that's happening less. I've had 3 classes now where that's happened. But okay. And so, like I said, hopefully most of you have looked over the PowerPoint and the videos that I posted for last week. So you're kind of caught up as far as the general settlement. But yeah, let's look then at I'll have to look at that. Let's see. As you might imagine, then we have unique conditions that come in with these colonies, and these colonies are very different. Yes, we do have class next week. So the conditions of these colonies are very different than they would be in a lot of other places. Now, one of the things that I think is important to address when we kind of look at the development of these colonies is that compared to England, it is actually surprisingly large as far as population, and the population grows faster. And there's like I said, there's a few reasons for this. I mean, certainly there are a lot of people that are migrating to the colonies from England and some of the areas that it controls. And there's good reasons for this. There's a much greater access to land. And, this culture is a culture in which land ownership is important. But England in itself is not necessarily a big place, and a great deal of the land is already owned. So there's a lot of people coming over here for opportunities to own land, if nothing else. And so that becomes a pretty big attraction. Most of these people that are coming over are younger, and as a consequence, they're having children at a younger age. Most of these people are also living a little bit, I guess, they're living a little bit hardier. That's a good way to say it. So they are working more hours during the day, etc. So one of the things you have is that the population overall is younger and tends to be having more children. And one of the great, around 16, which is the considered age of adulthood at the time, is double in the colonies of what it would be in England. So per capita, there are twice as many people under the age of 16. So people essentially approaching adulthood as opposed to people being over adulthood. Uh, Again, that says a lot about the overall age of the population. Like I said, the people are younger. They are marrying younger as a consequence. They're having children earlier. And so one of the consequences of having children at an earlier age is that you can have more children later on. So the birth rate is higher. And I think that goes a long way towards kind of explaining why the population growth is so phenomenal. How can it not be? Uh, when you have younger, healthier people getting married earlier, having more children. The other thing is, because these people are tending to live a little bit healthier, more rugged, exercising less crowded conditions, and of course, because of those less crowded conditions, less exposure to disease, people are living a little bit longer. So these colonies in less than a century have already grown to the point where they are a third of the size of the mother country. Their population per capita is almost twice as likely to be young. Those people are more likely to have families, and those people, because of the nature of their living conditions, they're more likely to exercise, be less exposed to disease and essentially poor health conditions due to overcrowding, because North America is a much bigger place. They're just living longer. Now, regionally, there is a pretty big difference. And for those of you who looked at the slides for the individual colonies for last week, you kind of get a notion as to why that fell out the way it did. But just in kind of a summarization of it, the northern states, New England in particular, is much more heavily populated in a much smaller area. So you have you have fewer square miles, but more people. And with so many essentially people, and especially natural harbors, things tend to be geared towards commerce, towards shipping. This will be the part of the country that embraces manufacturing labor as it begins to emerge. Conversely, the South, while it's much larger as far as square miles, has a smaller population, and the population is much less dense, because it is centered on agriculture. By the way, with this, why would you not need as many people, just in general, in order for that to function? Typically, when you look at urban areas as opposed to rural areas where people farm, do the rural areas tend to have a smaller population?
I
No.
think
Go ahead.
you're asking why did they require a smaller population for the agricultural area?
Yeah.
So I think that for cultivated lands, it doesn't take that too much manpower depending on how much land is being cultivated. Whereas when you're dealing with commerce and shipping, you do need people to get on the boats and handle the agreements and things like that. So it's probably more manpower required in organizing and such.
There's like I said, there's a lot more essentially aspects required, therefore more people required. Commerce and shipping and manufacturing require a lot more specialized labor, whereas agricultural labor tends to be more uniform and straightforward. And let's be fair too. It's kind of difficult to farm if there's a ton of people. You need land to be open. And so, like I said, the South naturally is larger, but tends to have is naturally larger, but tends to have far more essentially far fewer people involved. And like I said, that just makes sense. The problem that this creates, by and large, is that because there is such a difference in the labor, the economy, and the labor that is undertaken in the regional economy, is that the taxation that is imposed by England gets passed downward. So farmers in the South essentially selling their product to manufacturers, shippers in the North. So, costs in regards to taxes get passed downward. So England puts a tax on, say, tobacco products. So buying, selling, shipping tobacco products, the cost generally increases. Well, the people who engage in the manufacturing process, or the people who ship those goods, they don't just eat that increase, they pass it down. So therefore, when they are buying this, they are adjusting their prices, which means that there is a condition very more often than not in which essentially the North is taking to some degree economic advantage of the South, because it has very little alternative economically about who it might trade with. And this, the impact of taxation and the kind of conflict that it causes regionally is very common throughout our history. And again, even today, it's more, it is much more common for highly populated coastal areas to make decisions in regards to taxation that negatively impact more rural areas. That's just kind of unfortunately, how it is. But I do want you to understand that there is kind of a tension in regards to that. Now, in regards to labor, and remember I mentioned that there earlier when we were kind of going over some of this, so there's always this idea of class division. There is obviously a less marked class division in the colonies than there would be, say, in England proper, but there certainly were people at the bottom. Initially, in these colonies, most of the difficult labor, obviously, farming, construction, etc., were done by what we would refer to as indentured workers or indentured servants. And the indenturing just means that they are obligated by contract to work for somebody for a particular period of time. So they are for whatever reason, typically these people are essentially paying for the opportunity to come over, which means that somebody has to buy them a ticket for the boat and is going to give them a place to live. And so they're going to work that off. And so this person to whom they are in debt, their debtor, they work for them from an average of 5 to 7 years. That's pretty common for most of the indentured servants at the time. Now, after the prescribed period, they are, of course, free to go. But at this point, many of them, because they have not earned anything, they have simply paid off debt. Many of them will continue to work for their employer for a period of time. Now, the generous employers and the smart people, what they will do is that they will contract with these people essentially to often have access to general tools and sometimes even land. So that way, when they leave, they can begin farming independently for themselves. Now, some people get lucky. They actually become very prosperous and wealthy themselves. Some people just kind of remain basic kind of yeoman dirt farmer types. But one of the things I want to point out with this, as discouraging as that may seem, the average person over here with very little wealth who owns land, they still own more land than the average, essentially lower class person in England. Those people are essentially largely, essentially land laborers who rent essentially farm space from their landlord and pay it off by by selling those agricultural goods, and they never have a chance to own their own land ever. Like I said, land is like I said, land is one of the big attractions that brings people over here. Now, this will diminish over time for two reasons. One, it's because it becomes less common as the economy shifts. The other thing is that slavery will become a more common practice. And so let me explain how this works. There is a shift because of, and do I have this here? No, I sure don't. Oh, wish I'd brought that in there. So over the course of essentially the previous century, and this is true in all parts of the Americas, it starts largely with the Portuguese and the Spanish, and then finds its way to the English colonies as well. Indentured servitude over time decreases, but as more and more people settle, as more and more land is being used, as big crops, in particular in the early periods, does anybody remember what the big cash crop was?
Tea? Was it tea?
Close.
Tobacco.
Cotton.
Tobacco. Right.
Oh.
Tobacco. And it just when the Europeans originally started coming over here, especially when they were meeting some of the powerful indigenous civilizations, say like the Aztec, they were just, for whatever reason, one of the things that fascinated them most was the fact that they were drying out the leaves of a plant and inhaling the smoke into their lungs, and it became super fashionable. It also, of course, tobacco has addictive properties, so yeah, tobacco becomes this huge cash crop in all parts of the Americas, whether it's South America, the Caribbean, even the southern parts of North America, those colonies like the Carolinas and Georgia in particular. So this industry is growing, and there are fewer essentially people coming over who want to engage in this labor. They're more apt to be able to purchase their own land, etc. But that doesn't mean the demand for a workforce has gone down. Now, when the Spanish and the Portuguese first came over here, they didn't really have a huge problem with essentially forcing the indigenous people to engage in labor, whether they wanted to or not. So essentially a form of slavery there, forced labor. The problem with that is that as time progresses, the Spanish are doing something that the French did that the English happen to do less of in regards to the indigenous people, and that is basically intermarry, interbreed, and also try to convert them to their belief system. So, and just practically speaking, okay, so the first generation of, say, like Spaniards in the Caribbean, they meet indigenous people. They're very different, right? There's not much overlap in regards to things like language, culture, beliefs. What about 3 generations later when they're imposing Catholicism on them and people are having babies? The differences are the differences as sharp now? But so my point with this being is, like, if a culture is being adapted, and if you are through intermarriage and interbreeding having essentially, children of broad mixing,
Harder to differentiate between peoples.
yeah, it becomes more difficult to differentiate. I mean, this is something that happens all throughout history. I mean, groups of peoples come together and then they blend. That all human interaction is essentially cultural synthesis that forms something new. And so it kind of becomes difficult to continue to treat the natives this way, because quite frankly, the dividing lines between natives and people like the Spanish and the Portuguese isn't as clear as it was 2 generations ago, because that's what happens when you have that's what happens when people are intermarrying and interbreeding, and that's what happens when you are combining cultures. And again, that's just a natural process. But as I said, it doesn't decrease the need in any size, shape, or form for the need for labor. And so here's what happens. The Portuguese, and to a lesser degree the Spanish, and also the Dutch, have also been making inroads into West Africa. And one of the things that they discovered very quickly is that there were lots of large African kingdoms who never seemed to have a problem with going and essentially attacking weaker African peoples and enslaving them, and then trading those people for European goods that would make them more powerful, like, Western firearms. And so what happens is these Europeans take their manufactured goods and trade them to powerful Africans, who then essentially sell them people from other African groups that they've enslaved. And then those Europeans then transport those slaves to the Americas, where they essentially produce the raw goods that then go back to Europe for processing. And this is generally referred to as triangular trade. It's this system that feeds off of itself over and over and over. I apologize. Aloysa, am I saying that right?
Yeah.
Oh,
So I just want to be clear because I read chapter 1. I'm studying for my textbook, but I read how the Africans were the ones that will sell their children because they were in debt, and then
Yeah.
that's how slavery.
No, I want to be clear. Did that sometimes happen? Yes, but that was rare. What's happening is, and I don't know, there was a movie that came out, I think last year. There was quite a bit of controversy because it kind of glossed over some nastier parts of the history. The Woman King. And
Yes, I saw that movie.
yeah, a lot of people were criticizing that film because they didn't talk about the fact that that culture was essentially had become very powerful, because mainly what it had done is engage in war against its neighbors, take those people's slaves, and then sell them to Europeans. And as a matter of fact, there are numerous essentially African kingdoms that actually shift their capitals to the Western coast, in places like the Ivory Coast, the Gold Coast, and even the aptly named Slave Coast. And these are predominantly in northwestern Africa. So are there occasionally people that are selling their children? Yes, horribly, that does occasionally happen. Or do you have that kind of scenario that kind of plays out like Roots with LeVar Burton, where people are sometimes just straight up taken? Yes. But the vast majority of these people are essentially people that were conquered in war, and essentially being utilized as slave labor. And because there is a surplus, they are being sold for European goods, which make those kingdoms in Africa that are doing this even more powerful, because they are getting European technology. So yeah, I mean, like I said, again, that does come up. I don't want you to think that's the norm. Because what I'm describing there is
I just wanted to clear that, because when I read it, I was so confused.
yeah, no, like I said, most people don't sell their children as slaves.
Hope not.
Yeah, but you'd be surprised how many people sell their neighbors' children as slaves. It's like once you can, and obviously any kind of conflict, and certainly slavery, requires an othering of the other people. And so when you can say, whatever this powerful, West African kingdom is, can say, well, these aren't our people. This isn't part of our group. They're less primitive. They've always served us somehow. So if we want to go beat them up and take a bunch of them to sell them to somebody else because it's for our benefit, then that's fine. Because that's what powerful people do to weak people. They exploit them. They said, unfortunate, but that's unfortunate but true. And the reality is that there is no there is no part of the world, there is no civilization that doesn't have you know, examples of this and slavery. You know, and you know, thankfully, you know, we live in a time and in a part of the world where this is much less common, and has been morally condemned generally. But unfortunately, throughout most of human history, slavery is very common, pretty much happened everywhere. And it's, you know, usually pretty awful for slaves and, you know, for slaves in general. But like I said, this does create a unique condition with this one, because we have kind of there. This is not to say that this never happened. Like I said, Europeans are not really enslaving Europeans anymore. Europeans are occasionally being enslaved by people from the Middle East, but that's not happening as often. And certainly no European is buying those people. And Europeans, as I said, are largely no longer enslaving or attempting to enslave the indigenous people. And so the reason that you see such a focus at during this period of slavery as essentially slaves being sub-Saharan African is simply because the market has naturally progressed in a way in which this is the most common and plentiful source. And unfortunately, like I said, the region in and of itself, like I said, already had a slave labor system in place. It's simply expanding globally. So if you are one of those people who is unfortunate enough to be enslaved and then sold to a European, like I said, they're not going to keep you enslaved in Africa. They're going to transport you to where they need your labor, so to the Americas. The average trip is about 4 to 6 weeks, and the death rate's about 1 in 7. So it's pretty rough. And also depending on where you go, your life expectancy can vary. People in the Caribbean and South America, the Caribbean in particular, tend to die much faster. Just because of the nature of how the Spaniards treated this and the weather conditions. Actually, one of the best places for survivability, if you can call it that, is actually the southern parts of the American colonies. There's a little bit greater chance of survival there compared to the other parts of the Americas. And all said and done, you know, we estimate there's somewhere around the range of, you know, 13 million people that are forcibly moved over here and utilized as part of the system. And like I said, it's spread through the Caribbean and both the North and South American continents. But obviously, we're going to focus primarily on the North American continent and the English colonies. By the time we get to the end of the colonial period, this is so common, and the agricultural economy there has become so dependent on it that 1 in 5 people is actually a slave of African descent. Now, and again, just a practical question. Do you necessarily want a large slave labor class in any given society? Let's, you know, just assume that you are not one of those people that is enslaved, but you are benefiting from the system. Do you want a lot of slaves around?
Yes.
Yes, because it's for benefit. It's all about capitalism, right?
Well, I mean,
It's
yeah,
free labor.
I wouldn't call it capitalism. I call it imperialism and colonialism.
Yeah.
But
I would
well,
say a little bit of
business-wise,
both.
great for business,
yeah,
no?
there's the benefit in regards to labor.
Yeah.
Certainly. But
isn't
what
there
about-
also that they would revolt? So you don't want to have an overpopulation of slavery.
Yes, exactly. Difficult to control. So slave populations need to be pretty aggressively monitored. And I want you to understand that 1 in 5 is massive. generally, historically speaking, that 1 in 5 people in a region would be essentially considered chattel property is a lot. Typically, in most cultures, even at their peaks, it would be something like 1 in 20.
Professor,
Yes.
can I just ask, is this exactly what happened in Haiti? Because they had an overpopulation of slaves when the French finally kind of backed off of
Yeah,
the country?
yeah, and
Because
just
they
Haiti as
had
an example.
free blacks.
Yeah, it's a combination of several factors. Like you said, it is the fact that there's a massive slave workforce there compared to the people that are supposed to be controlling them. There's also as you mentioned, the French also find themselves in a position where they can't really maintain that kind of level of control because of what's going on in Europe. Um, when Haiti becomes independent, by the way, it's the second republic in North America in the Americas after us. Yeah, like I said, there so many people essentially who had been slaves, essentially fighting against a shrinking, controlling class, and those French, because of the Napoleonic Wars, they just don't have the resources to really militarily try to control it. Um, and so um, and by the way, since you mentioned Haiti and not just a successful slave revolt, but the successful creation of a nation built around former slaves who essentially make up the majority of the population. Why do you think that such a thing like that never really happened here? I mean, certainly, like I said, it's not the imbalance, the population imbalance isn't as heavy as it would have been, say, in Haiti, but 1 in 5 is still a lot. But you don't see that many slave revolts, and the slave revolts are never really all that successful.
Because
I would say because the land is bigger, it's a bigger nation. Haiti is a very small nation.
Well, certainly size is part of it, and there's a greater concentration of resources, more people to utilize it. But there's
I think the
another.
reason sorry to cut you off, Professor.
Go ahead.
I think the reason it happened is because of the displacement. Since they're coming to a new land and they're around new people and maybe a new language, culture, they're so I guess in shock of this new culture that they can't necessarily come together and put up a revolt of such. The Haitians in their own land, so they can do what they needed to do of the culture they understood. They were brought from Africa to the Europeans, and they were basically aliens in that land.
Well, but I mean, here's the thing, and like I said, there is potentially less cultural shock. But remember, Haiti's not not African either. Haiti's in the Caribbean. Those people were still brought somewhere else. And this is a condition that is multi-generational as well. Somebody being brought from Africa, and getting right off the boat's likely to be disoriented. 4 generations later, they're probably all Christian and speak English. It's not quite as shocking at that point. So you might be able to blame some initial disorientation, but so let me address that. Slavery at that point in time is prolific in quite a bit of Africa, but it is primarily northwestern Africa, in which you are seeing slave trade happening with European powers simply because of the proximity. If that makes any sense. Most slavery in Africa and other parts of Africa is internal. This is where these areas I'm talking about is where it becomes external. So let me just address that real quick. The reason that you don't see as many revolts is because there is a much more aggressive system of monitoring in North America than there is in, say, somewhere like Haiti. And the other thing is that there's a much greater focus on essentially the control of that population with, for lack of a better term, proven methods of coercion, whether that's violence, controlling the controlling the family unit, etc. And by the way, I always consider this one of the most effective, even though it's relatively insidious. But one of the things that happens, especially in when we talk about areas that are larger, is that people get together and they have children. And so not only are you owned, then your children are owned. And if I'm your owner and I control your children, unless you just really don't give a crap about your offspring, I control you through them, if nothing else. Everybody, most human beings, and this is not a bad thing at all, are attached to their offspring. That's a good thing, but it is a vulnerability. And it is the control of the family unit, by and large, that allows for this. And so, like I said, it's why, compared to, say, something like Haiti, such extraordinary circumstances have to occur. The system is so well regulated. The individuals are so well controlled through essentially the manipulation of movements and their own internal family and community dynamics. And frankly, too, the fact that most of these people are no longer speaking a distinct language. They are practicing the same, essentially, religion for the most part as the people who own them. That doesn't hurt either. Shifting cultural norms. So in that first weeks, we talked a little bit about kind of relationships with the natives. Sometimes good, sometimes bad. It just kind of depends on what's going on at the time, what the interests are. And I hope, does everybody remember the section on Virginia and how Virginia was in conflict with the trade organization, the Powhatan? And so there's this big economic conflict that occurs. And I hope, by the way, nobody's surprised that a lot of this conflict is either over essentially commerce or land. Everything's financial at the end of the day. So you have, in this instance, one of the first major conflicts between the colonies and a native group, and this group are referred to as the Pequot. Now, the Pequot largely reside in these areas in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and parts of Connecticut. And they control most of the fur trade in this region. Now, fair to say, fur trade, kind of a big deal, right? At this point, American animal furs. Clearly, people paying good money for it. I mean, the French built their entire North American holdings around the fur trade. Now, the English colonists in Massachusetts are also allied with the Narragansett and the Mohegan, so two distinct native groups as well. And here's something that the Massachusetts colonists and the Narragansett and the Mohegan all have in common. They all hate the Pequot, and they all want access to the Pequot's essentially monopoly over the fur trade. And by the way, one of the things that I think is worth mentioning here that this kind of illustrates is there is no uniform kind of conflict or movement in regards to the European settlers and the indigenous people. We have a tendency to think of the indigenous peoples all kind of getting along and being very kind of almost kind of, hippie granola-y, earth focused and everything. And none of that is true. They're human beings. They did not necessarily like each other. They were not necessarily, quote unquote, more in tune with nature. Plum, what do you mean by this? Any good move you can than the YouTube? I guess I'm not.
You meant
Are there
movie.
any good films, do you mean, that expand on that? I have to think about that one. But it's like I said, so is it the natives fought with each other all the time over land, over resources. Some natives were allied with the colonists, some natives weren't. It's all about, who, the mutual interest existing at the time. And so it certainly works out again for Massachusetts in these groups that they're allied to, because when they come together, they are stronger than the Pequot. None of these groups particularly like I said, like having to deal with the Pequot solely in regards to this. And so what's going to happen is that Massachusetts is going in trying to essentially continually deal with the Pequot. There are several people who act as intermediaries in order to purchase furs or access to hunting territory. And in one of these deals on a place just off the coast called Block Island, one of the colonists, a man named John Oldham, is going to be murdered. Now, and by the way, was John Oldham most likely murdered by a Pequot? Yeah, that's why he was there. That's who he was meeting. Can't say for sure, but yeah, that's most likely the case. Now, given that the Narragansett and the Mohegan and the Massachusetts colonists all kind of hate the Pequot because of this economic advantage that they have, it doesn't take much to turn this essentially murder into a reason to have a full-blown war. People tend to respond to you how you have responded to them. And so already resenting the Pequot, these groups start engaging in violence against them, in particular the Massachusetts colonists. So they attack the Pequot. The Pequot attack them back. Oh, sorry. Now, they're certainly not going to, the Pequot, like I said, as a trade group, relatively powerful, but when you're talking about Massachusetts colony and these other native groups that are allied with them, the Pequot may not be in the best position now. They're probably going to be outnumbered. But they do find a leader, a man named Sassakus, and he is considered the sachem of the Pequot. So he is a spiritual leader. But he's also a very gifted military tactician. And what he is doing with this is largely finding other groups of people who are other groups of natives who are against essentially this particular alliance that they're fighting. So the Narragansett and the Mohegan and the Massachusetts colonists and that group, the Sassakus is finding allies with other native groups to join up with the Pequot. And so now we have essentially a full-fledged war going on. So essentially the Massachusetts colonists and its native allies and the Pequot as a native group and all of its allies. Now, this kind of turns the tide, honestly, and the Pequot end up doing, frankly, fairly well. As I said, Sassakus is actually a very gifted tactician as well. And so what the colonists are going to do something pretty aggressive here, because they hope to essentially now affect the morale of the Pequot. And then what they're going to do is they're going to a Pequot encampment close to the Mystic River. When the men are out essentially, fighting and hunting, etc., they're just going to come in and slaughter all the women and children. So, and as you might imagine, it does affect morale. And not just for the Pequot fighting, but for all the people who have attached themselves to the Pequot as the leaders of this, essentially, this particular cause and this particular side. Because the first thing that they're thinking is oh my gosh, the Massachusetts colonists and the Mohegan and the Narragansett have really, upped the ante here. Now they're just killing they might kill our families too. Is this worth it to us? And for many of them, of course, the answer is no. It is not worth it to us to risk having our families be slaughtered. So they begin to pull out, which means that the Pequot's allies, as they start to essentially melt away, the Pequot don't have as powerful a fighting force as they used to. And the Pequot will ultimately be defeated in what is not even a full-blown battle. It's referred to as a fight. It's called the Fairfield Swamp Fight. The remaining Pequot will be captured, and they will sign a treaty in regards to their territory, and this is overseen by the Massachusetts colonists, called the Treaty of Hartford, and they are essentially officially dissolved. Now, some Pequot were essentially cut loose, but the majority of them, those who had not been killed, will essentially be taken prisoner, and they will be sold as slaves to people in Bermuda. So like this is, this is very extreme, but the reason I'm giving you this is because I want you to kind of have an example of what this kind of stuff, what these kind of conflicts look like. Like I said, it is usually some colonial group and some, with its native allies against some other native group, and it can often get terrifyingly bloody, and usually with very harsh repercussions for the loser. And this will kind of continue to escalate. Another one of these here called Metacom's War. It's also called King Philip's War because they were kind of taking a jab at the King of Spain at the time. Whatever. The colonists in Massachusetts, remember I said their relationships with the natives are strange. They've got some buddies, and then they've got people that they just cannot stand. And in this instance, they are violating territory that is part of what is considered the Wampanoag group, including violating a treaty where they will send essentially Christian missionaries to them to try to get them to convert. Now, the Wampanoag don't trust the missionaries because they consider that they might be spies, and many of them are. And they are also, of course, essentially trying to convert people to a religion that is not theirs, that would draw them more closely to European culture. And so the Wampanoag eventually will simply stop tolerating the presence of missionaries within their boundaries, especially as Massachusetts keeps trying to move into their territory. Now, one of these missionaries, who most likely was spying at the same time, was a man named, one of these converted people, a man named John Sassoon. So this is a man who was a native who was converted and was relaying information. They kill him. He's a spy. They consider him a traitor, so they murdered him. And so what's going to happen is that finding out about this, the Massachusetts colonists are going to essentially take 3 Wampanoag who have been associated with the crime, though there is no real proof that they are associated with the crime, and they're just going to execute them for Sassaman's murder. So like I said, there's nothing particularly clean about any of this, clearly. So Sassaman is often spying. He is considered a traitor. He is murdered. The men that are suspected of the murder are killed without any proof that they were actually involved. So once again, we have a big fight on our hands. Now, the Wampanoag are actually some pretty tough people. They're used to living a little bit more ruggedly, and they often engage in what we would call more guerrilla style tactics of fighting. So they're not meeting people on the battlefield. They're the ones that are attacking in small groups. They're raiding outlying areas. It's, very much frontier warfare as opposed to people meeting each other on the battlefield. But their raids are becoming so effective that they're actually even able to hit some of the outlying areas of Boston, which is, of course, the largest city in Massachusetts at that time, and continues to be so. The problem for the Wampanoag is that Metacom's initial successes with these, as they move further and further into the territory of Massachusetts, getting closer and closer to Boston, they're getting further away from their own lands. And so that means that they are further away from their home base. Their supply lines are getting longer and longer. That's always a problem, because that means you have to wait longer for supplies. You have to wait longer for reinforcements. You have to retreat farther back in order to get to areas of security.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Since they were fighting for it and killing basically everybody, wouldn't they be taking their weapons and their belongings and just to begin growing like more wise in that area instead of just going back and getting more?
Do you mean Metacom and his people, taking like the colonist resources?
Resources, also weapons, or like it wouldn't be necessary for them to go back to their home base to get the supplies that they need, basically.
Yeah. Well, they are certainly taking things. The problem is that, of course, at some point in time, that comes to an end. Like I said, they can threaten areas around Boston. They can threaten essentially to eventually attack Boston. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they can set up permanent bases around Boston. And it's one thing, to take some, if you take a rifle and ammunition off somebody that you've killed, what you have is a rifle and their ammunition. You don't have, like I said, what happens if the rifle breaks and you don't have somebody to fix it? How do you, and if you don't know how do you make more ammunition? And part of the reality is too, is that lots of these people had guns already. We have this notion that, these European colonists, had such an advantage because the indigenous people didn't have access to the same amount of technology. When it comes to basic weaponry, they really did. Lots of natives were, trading for rifles, and other kind, and weaponry. And, by the way, great example in regards to this. The horse is not indigenous to North America. Native Americans got access to the horse when Europeans started bringing them over. Clearly, they utilized horses very well. Many of the Plains peoples are some of the best horse riders in the world. And think about that. 200 years in the span of 200 years, they went from, what is this animal, to, I can slide around on the saddle and shoot people mid-gallop. That is, certainly denotes a great deal of skill. But like I said, but the technological difference isn't really the same. It is about the consistent access to goods and resources. And then, like in this instance, when you are fighting a war, it's very rare that somebody is able to essentially set up something where they are as secure close to the enemy as they would be secure close to their own areas of power. And that's why that seizure of technology and goods really isn't going to make as much difference long term. And then basically what's going to happen with this then, as they overstretch themselves, and they begin to expend too much of what they have, a lot of their allies are going to start to disappear, which means now they have even less. And towards the end, they are becoming so unsuccessful at this point that even more of their allies leave, and eventually it's just the Wampanoag, and they are hunted down. And Metacom, due to the fact that he was so initially successful, is treated pretty brutally And this is very much in that kind of, almost medieval European tradition. What they're going to do is draw and quarter him. So what I mean is that they're going to pull him apart by the limbs. That's what being quartered is. And you can do that with machines. You can do that with horses. Always pretty brutal to tie a rope around each limb, tie it to a horse, and then send the horses off in different directions. But by then there were also machines that could draw and quarter people too. But yeah, I mean, that's how he dies. And as a warning, they take his head and they put it on a pike just outside the city of Plymouth, where it stays and rots for the next 20 years as a warning.
So quartered is basically when they rip your limbs apart.
Yeah, they rip when you've heard that phrase, being torn limb from limb.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I said quartered just means essentially, that idea of you being torn into 4 pieces. You're being pulled by each arm and each leg. Yeah, and that's one of the we'll talk about some of these things like being drawn and quartered, like being tarred and feathered. These can actually be a lot more brutal than you might imagine. It's nothing compared to like some of the brutality that we would be talking about if we were doing the world history. But some of this can still be pretty brutal, yeah, for sure. This one I want to address because it is important, because 2 things. I want you to see how internally there are always problems. And I want you to kind of get a notion of how people in the colonies often tend to think in regards to the mother country and the people in charge, because it is very different. And like I said, America is a weird thing. We are, the people who came here who formed the germ of this nation are, people of English descent who immigrated over. And yet America becomes something not only quite a bit different than that, it also basically at some point in time gets sick of being under English rule. Our nation was formed by an act of rebellion and secession. And that is not the first time that those kind of issues have come up. Now, many of the colonies, in particular royal colonies, and those are the colonies in which the King of England appoints the governor, have begun instituting policies, especially in the middle of the 1700s, that kind of see a widening of the gap between the wealthy and the poor. And this is done a lot of ways. Land grants. Kings start giving their buddies lots of land grants. And a great example for those of you who remember from last week, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was just one big land grant. And so anybody who wanted land in Pennsylvania had to essentially buy or rent it from William Penn, because that whole thing was technically his. So, when you have things like land grants and you increase taxation and you give, and you just general political favoritism to people who are already in positions of authority, you see the middle class begin to shrink. And that is expressed, like I said, primarily by limitations of the ability of essentially people who aren't in the upper classes to purchase land. And like I said, as I said earlier, that's one of the big reasons that people were leaving England and Europe to come to the Americas to begin with, was the opportunity to own land and property for themselves. Now, like I said, obviously for a lot of people, this is a very, undesirable trend, but it doesn't seem to be slowing down. And in Virginia, the then King Charles II is going to give the royal governorship to a personal friend, Sir William Berkeley. Now, Berkeley's governorship is unpopular, and for 2 reasons. One, because like I said, he is engaging in a ridiculous amount of taxation and land control. And the other thing is, he's just kind of an idiot. He's not really cut out for political duties at all. And like I said, what little he is is doing is mainly just essentially increasing taxation for the benefit of the royal government. So when these issues arise, one of the things that kind of distinguishes Berkeley from a lot of other royal governors is that he has zero diplomacy about it. Somebody says, this is becoming unpopular. A lot of people are now no longer able to purchase land. And of course, Ed Berkeley's response is, who cares? This is the average person should be working for landowners just like they did in England. Who cares if they can, they're not smart enough. They're not important enough to do this. And really a great deal of the Stuart monarchy, and certainly as expressed by guys like Governor Berkeley, is just that more top-down land control type of system that is common in England should be implemented in the North American colonies. One of the effects that this has is that those poorer classes of people, if they want to have land of their own at all, have to move further west. Now, moving further west means that you are on the fringes of colonial civilization, which means that you are less likely to be supported by other colonists. It means you're farther away from capital cities, and you are also more likely to be attacked by natives. So these are the people living on the edge of civilization. Their lives are hard, and they are so much more likely to be killed via violence. They're more, and of course, more likely to do things like starve or freeze to death in winter. And in this instance, as a lot of these people are kind of fleeing this, they're going to start bumping up in these western areas territory claimed by the Susquehannock. And the Susquehannock are basically going to go through and just start killing people, burning down, murdering families, burning down homes, burning down farms, stealing livestock, etc. And since they don't expect since they're not getting a great deal, what they ask for is that they can essentially get weapons and form militias for the purpose of protecting themselves from Susquehannock attack. And Berkeley's going to say, no, you can't do that. You can request aid from us, and we will build some forts in the area which we will keep staffed for your protection. But we will not sanction any kind of unauthorized military activity on the part of, some kind of local militia. Well, and so in regards to these people suffering from constantly being attacked, and Berkeley doesn't seem to be offering a lot of aid, right? And he seems to also be actively forbidding them from engaging in a great deal of practical self-defense. Doesn't really make sense, does it? Why would Berkeley not want these people at the very least be able to defend themselves? That doesn't necessarily cost him any money. Well, let me tell you that the reason that Berkeley is not assisting these people is that he has an agreement with the Susquehannock. He is their middleman for the deerskin trade in Virginia. So Berkeley and his business interests deal directly with the Susquehannock, and like I said, his company that is deer trade in Virginia because of his alliance with the Susquehannock. They essentially collect the deer skins, and if it's going to be sold in the colonies or to Europeans, it goes through him. So practically speaking, Berkeley has sold out these people living on the frontier to maintain essentially a very, very profitable business. And of course, it doesn't take anybody with a brain very long to figure this out. And so what will happen is that all these poor folks on the frontier are going to find a leader who kind of galvanizes them all together, a man named Nathaniel Bacon. Now, Bacon's a extremely well-educated, extremely intelligent, very charismatic, well-spoken guy. As a matter of fact, his family, he comes from an aristocratic background. Here's the problem. He's made his family very angry. He's kind of a ne'er-do-well, that, proverbial prodigal son, just kind of a general disappointment. And since his family basically has disowned him, and he has found himself kind of living, a common lifestyle on the edge of Virginia colony here. But like I said, he is a very good background, very well educated, very charismatic, and has a lot of natural leadership qualities. And so people kind of start gravitating towards him. And he is talking about, taking care of themselves, striking back. And so the first thing that they do is that all these militias that had come together for self-defense just ignore Berkeley's rule against that. Susquehannock attack, they get together and they hit back. They're not going to tolerate being attacked without defending themselves anymore. But that's not the real source of their problem. The real problem is Berkeley. And so in the capital at the time is Jamestown. And so what's going to happen is that after they deal with the Susquehannock, a lot of these people are going to form a large militia army, and they're going to, in turn, now go back east and attack Jamestown itself. And in the process, actually, quite a bit of the city gets burned to the ground. And you better believe they're coming for Berkeley. And so here's what Berkeley does in the face of this. He takes some of the soldiers that are still in charge of the defense of the city, and he basically commandeers them, and they flee.
So wait, so his troops turned against him, his own troops?
No, he takes what's left and they just run away.
Wow.
Yeah. Berkeley's thinking in terms of living to fight another day, clearly. But yeah, it's this incredibly dismissive, abusive, corrupt figure. Hopefully nobody's too shocked when he essentially takes soldiers that should be defending the town, and basically uses them for protection so he can save his own skin. Turns out that he values his own skin even more than he values deer skin. Now, with Berkeley fleeing, Bacon's forces take control of Jamestown and most of the surrounding colony. And they are actually in the process of issuing what they would call their Declaration of Liberties. And this was essentially built around this belief that as Englishmen, they had certain rights that the government could not take from them, and that things that Berkeley was doing, like preventing them from purchasing land or not being able to defend themselves against attacks, was a violation of those rights. Things that seem fairly reasonable to us, and to us in the 20th and 21st centuries. Things like, owning land and not being taxed to death and being able to defend oneself from being attacked. These all seem like reasonable things. And it's, by the way, the idea of this is becoming more so. Now, what's going to happen, though, is that Bacon is going to die of dysentery during this period. Bacon was, the galvanizing force. He is what held this together. And so when Bacon dies, there is no real leadership to kind of take his place. What there are a bunch of people with varying ideas who all think that they should be in charge and that their ideas are the best, and they become very fractured. They even start fighting amongst themselves on some occasions. And what happens then is Berkeley is going to not only get those troops that he had, but gather some more loyal troops from other parts of the colony, and they're going to sweep back in and retake Jamestown. And then, without trial, he's basically going to take all the rebel leaders and brutally execute them in a pretty vicious fashion. And the reason that Berkeley is doing this is because, like I said, this escalated out of his control, obviously, fairly quickly. And what he is trying to do is instill enough fear that this isn't repeated. The problem is that it is so violent, it is such an egregious violation of general policies of due principle under English law that people are, even people who are of similar political sentiment are horrified. And Charles II, the King of England at the time, it basically has to wash his hands of him. So, because like I said, he can't be seen to be in support of this kind of violent, radical action. And so Charles disowns him, he strips him of his title and his lands, and Berkeley's career is over. And what he'd saved from his, few years of having monopoly over the deerskin trade in Virginia was not enough essentially to save him financially, and he does ultimately become destitute. And so again, there are issues of legal class struggle and control of resources and taxation. And you can see here the colonies are already becoming a place where that kind of traditional authority is questioned very frequently. Maximilian, go ahead.
Two questions. First question, I'm not seeing too many years on these slides, so
I will hit you with big dates when it's important. I'm mainly trying to just kind of give you narrative so you understand cause and effect. When big dates come up, say like the onset of our revolution or the end of our revolution, I'll let you know specifically.
Okay, and also, how long after Bacon's death did Berkeley swoop in to retake Jamestown?
It was just a few months. I don't remember off the top of my head specifically, but it was a 3 to 6 month period.
Okay.
Not long at all. Which again should give you a notion as to how vital Bacon's presence was to kind of keeping this movement together. Like I said, clearly their ships were not all going in the same direction. Once, like I said, once Bacon died, he really was the one who was kind of keeping all of that together. But like I said, the main thing, like I said, is I just want you to understand that the colonies are kind of always this way.
Quick outro. What happens to Berkeley after he's stripped of his title and position?
Basically, he goes back to England in disgrace. He becomes essentially impoverished after that. He never really holds up a political office of any importance again. He just kind of becomes, a formerly wealthy, mid-tier, guy with a little bit of land and, only essentially parts of his privileges as somebody who had a title before. I know that's not as, as cool and romantic as we necessarily like it to be. We'd like to see him maybe suffer a little bit more for that, but like I said, it's not so much a punishment as it is a discarding, because the monarchy and a lot of the government in general has to distance themselves from him because his actions were so extreme.
Got it.
So, all right. So this next part here, gang, because I want to set up some of the other conflict here, is the presence of the French in the area. The French also have territory in North America. And as a matter of fact, there is territory west of the colonies that was essentially called New France, that was so created in around 1663 by Louis XIV. That's the famous Louis the Sun King, the one who built the palace at Versailles. Louis was clever. knew how to play the game of politics. Absolutely. Now, from then on, the French have a pretty consistent presence in North America, but it's pretty small. They only have about 40,000 colonists at peak at any given time. And the primary reason that they have so few colonists is that they are interested in trade with the natives, mainly in regards to animal furs and animal skins. Why with that, why, since they're only really interested in trade, would they not need as many people?
Can you ask that again?
So, like I said, they only have about 40,000 colonists because their primary interest is in trade in regards to animal skins, animal furs. Why then would they not need as many people in North America as, say, like those in the English colonies?
Because
Why
they,
is it?
they
Go
already
ahead.
have the natives doing the work that they would otherwise be doing themselves.
Yeah, it's not like they're trying to farm. It's not like it's not like they're trying to create industry. They're just buying stuff from people who already are doing the labor. It's like, I don't need to go live in the grocery store. I don't need to work there. I just go buy the stuff. So as a consequence, New France is a very big area, but it doesn't really have too many Frenchmen in it. As a matter of fact, there are only 3 areas, urban centers in all of New France: Montreal, Quebec, and New Orleans. All connected to some degree by the Mississippi, because why would you need more than that? Now, here's what I think is interesting and certainly differentiates it from how the English colonists are functioning. The English colonists are looking for land. They're building permanent settlements, very frequently. Lots of these people are farmers. So they very often have conflicts because they are just going to be displacing natives. The French work in precisely the opposite direction. They don't want to displace natives because they're trading with them. There's not that many of them. They have no incentive to try to displace them. It doesn't make any sense. And so the connection with the natives and the interaction is much more cordial. It's much more intimate, and much more, I guess, consistently even, because it is a mutually beneficial exchange that's taking place. And one of the things that this results in is that the French trappers and French entrepreneurs that go to America, yes, they tend to live in very kind of rough and rugged conditions, certainly. But like I said, that means that they're working very closely with the natives. And it wasn't uncommon for a lot of these Frenchmen to have native wives, sometimes more than one. Because, they're going to be here for years, maybe forever. So that in and of itself is not unusual. And that's one of the reasons that the French often had more native allies, especially in some of the conflicts that we'll talk about, despite the fact that there just weren't that many Frenchmen in North America. Now, before, when both of these sets of colonies were still growing, and obviously growing in very different ways, there wasn't really a whole lot in regards to dispute. Why would there be? There would be no need. But as they start to kind of bump into each other, as their borders start to kind of clash, there's going to start to be some conflict between the Englishmen in North America and the English colonies, and then the Frenchmen in New France. And this begins in the early 1750s, 51, 52, as colonists begin moving into the Ohio River Valley. And most of these folks are from Virginia. And the governor of Virginia at the time, and I apologize, I don't remember his name, was going to send a major named George Washington. Yes, the same George Washington. And he's going to send him to a fort, Lebeau, to ask essentially the French to withdraw from that area. Now, the French have been well ensconced in that area for a while. This is, this territory, despite it now being disputed, has been theirs for the longest time. So this little tiny militia force from Virginia, under the orders of the Virginia governor, is basically going to say, all right, we're claiming this territory for, our colony as part of the larger British Empire. You need to get out now. What do you think the French are going to say?
Heck no, we won't go.
Yeah, they're going to Marie
Absolutely
Chevalier laugh right in their faces. What, ho, ho, ho. Don't let the fort door hit you on the rear on the way out. You've got to be kidding. And by the way, one of the things that fascinates me in regards to this is that the governor of Virginia is giving the French an ultimatum with no real leverage. How do you have to have leverage in order to negotiate. You certainly have to have leverage if you're going to deliver an ultimatum to somebody. And there isn't any really leverage to speak of. So again, it just fascinates me how idiotically, to some degree, this was approached. Now, understanding that they can't just shift the French. The French are well entrenched there. There's nothing that they can't just scare them to go away. They don't have the military force to do that. So what they're going to start doing is building forts along kind of just adjacent in many areas to where the French already are, France's existing forts. So now they're kind of moving in militarily. They're setting up little bases, areas of security, and they're challenging the boundaries between these British colonies and New France by building these forts. Now, 9 times out of 10, and it's certainly the case with this, a fort is essentially an attempt to create a secure area near or in enemy territory. So if you were the French and you were defending your territory and you saw the British building forts, what would your response be?
Break it down before it's complete.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Destroy it. Why give the enemy the chance to secure themselves close to you when you can just wipe it out beforehand? And so they're trying to build these forts, and the French just basically keep attacking them and burning these things to the ground or taking the fort over themselves. And again, I'm not trying to be horribly cruel or anything, but when I say that this as a conflict is not being well managed from the perspective of that British colonial end, I mean, that's what I'm saying here. This is really frequently not being particularly well thought out. Maximilian.
So were these poorly thought out strategies being enacted by George Washington, or was this someone else?
No, this is predominantly, like I said, a strategy coming from the governor of Virginia. Washington has essentially been trying to essentially attempting to act as he's essentially the military escort in this in a lot of instances. His job more often than not is essentially kind of scout and reconnoiter in the region to try to figure out where the French are. So strategically, I mean, it's not Washington's finest hour by any stretch of the imagination, but most of this is because he is being put in a very difficult situation. And now Washington is going to make a mistake here, though again, it's not entirely his fault, but it's going to lead to some pretty big consequences. And this is essentially the conflict at Duquesne and the eventual fall of what's called Fort Necessity, or Duquesne. I never know how to pronounce the French particularly well. Washington is going to take 150 volunteers, so colonial militia volunteers, and in addition to a few dozen Iroquois mercenaries that are acting as scouts. and they're going to establish a fort here near this pre-existing French fort, Duquesne. And what's going to happen is that the French, getting wind of this, are going to attack, and there's going to be a full-scale battle here. And shockingly, in this instance, probably due to the sheer number of volunteers, Washington is going to be victorious. Here's the problem. The general expectation would be that this would be considered essentially seized territory. They would take the fort. At some point in time, the French would probably come back in, build a new fort, try to resecure that fort, and we just keep going. But what happens is that the Iroquois, having essentially acted as advanced scouts, have taken quite a few prisoners themselves. And while the general rules of European warfare would state that these captured essentially French officers would be sold back, and that the essentially enlisted men would just be stripped of all their weapons and released, the Iroquois do this thing essentially to, the equivalent of what we would say is kind of the counting of coup, taking of something from the enemy to demonstrate victory and courage in battle. And in this case, what the Iroquois do is they take scalps. So yeah, they cut somebody's scalp along the front of their hairline there, and then they peel that whole piece off. And then they essentially treat it, and they wear that, and that demonstrates their prowess in battle. And certainly ripping the scalp off of somebody is a good demonstration that you have in fact conquered them in battle. Maximilian, yeah.
This wasn't a very big battle then, because I know you said that the French had 4,000, just under 40,000 people, but they didn't have a huge military force.
No. So yeah, this is, like I said, this is a relatively equitable battle. So less than 200 people fighting less than 200 people. But like I said, but there aren't that many deaths necessarily. Like I said, it's not so much the issue of, like I said, it's really not the issue of deaths from battle, or it is the breakdown of what are considered the practical rules, because like I said, they're supposed to be essentially selling these officers back and releasing the enlisted men. And what happened is that there are several of these people that are essentially murdered by these native allies that they have hired. And this makes the French very angry to hear that French prisoners have been murdered. And of course, Washington, unfortunately, in his position, he couldn't have done a whole lot about this except not hire these Iroquois scouts to begin with. Or perhaps knowing the culture, maybe had tried a little bit harder to not leave prisoners with them. But what's going to happen with this is, because this has gotten so insanely bloody and violent, and such, general rules of, civilized warfare have been violated, there's going to be a huge concentration of French forces from all over that region. So all of a sudden, dozens of French forts are emptying out, and all these troops are converging in this area. Now, since their own fort was not completed and Duquesne was basically destroyed, they're going to pull back, and they're going to build essentially a very basic defensive fort, just kind of palisades, wooden walls and everything, very quickly to try to, they hope, survive this. And this fort is called Fort Necessity. And it certainly was a necessity for them if they wanted to survive. What will then happen is that this French force, which is about 4 or 5 times bigger than them, will attack Fort Necessity, and they will overwhelm them. And Washington is going to lose about 100 of his 150 men. And at that point, they are going to surrender. And they, of course, they will surrender. The French obviously will be, will behave in, more accordance with, what are considered civilized rules of warfare than, say, the Iroquois. So they'll just essentially keep the officers prisoner. Washington himself, as a commanding officer, is actually allowed to lead those surviving troops back to Virginia. But what follows with this then is essentially a collapse of most of the fort structures that had been built by the colonists at the time. So all this work that had been done essentially now becomes completely undone because this galvanized the French, and they're going to essentially start coming out in big numbers, which obviously they hadn't done before, and destroying as many English forts as possible. So in many respects, as ill-advised as all of this was from the beginning, this ends up being the worst because it actually ends up undoing a great deal of the little progress that the Virginia colonists had made trying to move into the region. So, and I know we're almost to the end here. I just kind of want to get us where we're set up for what is coming next, and I will record a quick video so that you can look at that later on in the week. So I apologize. Like I said, we had to take up quite a bit of the first part of class. So the reaction here with this is pretty intense because this now escalates into a bigger war. Now, typically, what would happen in instances like this is the mother countries would go to war with each other, and their colonies would end up kind of being sucked into it. But in this instance, it's kind of the reverse. These countries' colonies are fighting each other, and that is creating a larger conflict. So what will essentially become the largest war ever fought to date, and the first essentially world war, will happen because Virginia colony, essentially military groups attempting to take the Ohio River Valley from the French, just escalated it well beyond normal levels. And so now Great Britain, England, will be going to war with France over this. So the mother countries are now involved, and then all of their allies fighting, fighting each other as well. So what is the reaction over in Great Britain other than, what the heck did these stupid colonials do? We're entering a war. This war is going to be fought in Europe and in North America. That's going to be kind of a pain in the rear. Given what's going on, they want to concentrate as much of this fighting on solving the, in North America as possible, largely in the hopes that if they can settle territorial issues, they can end the war quickly. That turns out to not be the case, but that's what they want. And like I said, the problem is that as this expands and more fighting happens in Europe, like I said, it just becomes a total world war. The colonists, on the other hand, it's a little bit different. They're not used to fighting on this big a scale. Like I said, scraps with native groups, occasional fighting with, other, colonists from other countries, kind of like what was happening prior, up until this and kind of caused this. That was the norm for them. But being involved in an actual war, something that, that involved the mother countries that spanned, multiple continents, that's not something that they're used to. And one of the discussions, even though it doesn't bear any fruit, I think is interesting because there is a gentleman named Benjamin Franklin, same guy, I'm sure you've heard of him, proposes a temporary union between all the colonies, which he calls the Plan of Union, which would have seen essentially an executive called the President General of the United Colonies, a legislature called the Grand Council. You can see here kind of the germ of the idea of the colonies coming together and kind of a centralized authority for them. Like I said, this is back in the this is in the 1750s. So, we're still a few decades away from our own revolution, but you can see that a lot of these ideas are already kind of beginning to germinate. Now, this will be categorically rejected. The British government has no interest in this because they don't want the colonies engaging in broad-scale cooperation. That's dangerous to their position, especially when they have royal governors in place. Most of the colonial leadership also rejects this because they don't want to be beholden to the decisions and needs of other colonies. So there is only loose cooperation as this is going on, but the germ of that idea is there. And again, one of the things that I want to emphasize with this is the idea that these colonies are always just so in love with each other and constantly cooperating. No, they're really not. The colonies consider themselves, they are all English colonies and they are close to each other. But, a New Yorker does not consider themselves beholden to a Virginian or vice versa. And their governments don't consider that their governments necessarily have to consistently interact. And there's even, like I said, even regional dislike of each other in some instances. And it really isn't until things like our second federal government, the one that our current Constitution created, and after the war, in the War of 1812, and even the conditions after our Civil War, in which you start to see the kind of unity that we think of as the norm today. Nobody even used the term American until after the War of 1812. Like I said, if prior to that, even as a nation, people didn't call themselves Americans. They say, I'm a resident of the United States, I'm a New Yorker or a Virginian. So that very kind of loose affiliation was very much the norm. So, like I said, again, I apologize, gang, that I wasn't able to finish everything up today. I will record a quick little video later this afternoon and post it so that we can finish this one up. And I will make sure that the future ones are maybe trimmed back a little bit. And also, we won't spend the first hour on discussing the course. So like I said, since we're ending the half hour early, it's 1:30. If you're good, if you don't have any questions, please feel free to go. I'll see you next week.